session arranged by the Research Center for Biosystematic and Evolution. Thank you for joining us today. This time we have three speakers from abroad with very fascinating topics about how to write the great papers and get published. Our speakers are editor in the International Journal of Plant Science. We have the three of them are all editors, so hang on. Sorry if I'm not correct, but Christina is the chief editor, and Christina Cruz is the chief editor, and then we have James Ellis as the managing editor, and Juliana as one of the editors, I suppose. So it's evening there, so I really highly appreciate the willingness to give the talk today. In the next hour, we will hear the presentation, and along the way, the audience may want to raise questions through chat, either in Indonesian or English. I will try to do my best to translate the question in Indonesian one. Or audience also can raise questions directly to the speakers after they finish presenting. So I guess now over to you. Who's going first, James?
It's me, Juliana. I'm first.
Oh, okay. Please.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank Jasper Michael Mambersar for being my co-conspirator in inviting us to give this talk. I'm going to just give you guys a quick introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to James and Chris to start us off. As you heard, Chris is the editor-in-chief and James is the managing editor. I'm a baby editor there. I just started. I've only handled a few manuscripts, but I've been an editor at other journals. And so tonight we hope to give you some of our best advice on how to get published in our great journal and in any other journal you want. So with that, I'm going to give you a little talk outline, I hope, if my thing will click. Interesting. There it is. Okay. So James is going to give us a little overview of managing editor. And then Chris will talk a little bit about editor-in-chief and then also give some general advice. And then what we're going to do, because it's late at night here, we're going to let James and Chris answer a bunch of questions. And then I will take my turn and I will be able to answer questions at the end, and I will stick it. I know Jasper told me that there could be a lot of questions and I'm ready to take all of them at the end. So with that, James and Chris, if you just want to give me a next slide when you want me to go forward, and take it away, James.
Sure. Thank you, Juliana. Juliana did just start with IJPS, but she is a rock star editor. We're happy to have her, and we hope that she can stay with us forever because she's dynamite. My name is James Ellis. I work for the University of Chicago Press, and I've been working with this journal for about 15 years, a little bit more than that. I'll give you a brief history of the journal. I'll tell you about what I do for the journal, which applies to other journals. And then I'll give an example of a paper that we published, and I think is kind of representative of the kind of thing that we look for. First, a thing about IJPS. Next year is our birthday. We turn 150 years. It's a big deal. We have lots of new material. The journal is quite old. It was established by the first head professor of botany at the University of Chicago in 1896. His name is John Merle Coulter. It started out as a very small provincial bulletin called the Botanical Bulletin, changed its name the next year to the Botanical Gazette, which it held for over 100 years. And then in 1992, we changed our name to be more representative of the material, the international reach, to the International Journal of Plant Sciences. And so we've had it that name ever since then. Our scope is pretty unique, and this is something you want to pay attention to for IJPS or any other journal. Our scope includes genetics and genomics, developmental and cell biology, biochemistry and physiology, morphology and anatomy, systematics, evolution, paleobotany, plant microbe interactions, and ecology. And we have editors who specialize in each of these fields. We seek basic fundamental plant biology, and it's research that's too narrow to appeal to broad international audience, tends to be returned to other authors, to return to authors without review. Things that are applied, such as natural products, crop improvement, horticulture, this kind of thing, this is very valuable, but we don't have the editorial specialty to review that kind of material, so we don't accept it. We'll quickly return it without review. Sometimes people will send us things that are substandard, it doesn't have the right material in it. We'll also return that with good ideas for where to submit it or how to resubmit it as a better paper. We do welcome research that describes novel results, new perspectives on topics of interest to the international community of plant scientists. And as a testament to the international scope of the journal, the graph at the right shows all the journals who cited IJPS last year. Each color represents a different journal, so it's a broad spectrum of publications that feed off of the kind of material that we publish. IJPS is a bi-monthly. It's listed in over 170 indexes worldwide. It has an insight score of 1.5. So we do publish a broad range of material. It does have a broad international scope. So that's a little bit about IJPS. If we move to the next slide, the thing about managing editors are I am paid by the University of Chicago. I do a journal in plant biology. I go to plant meetings. I work with authors, researchers, editors, but I also do a journal in consumer research and another one in animal physiology. Typically, managing editor is a paid position, and we serve as a liaison between the publisher and the content creators, the authors, the editors, and the reviewers. We have a supporting role in the publishing process. We keep the reviewers and editors on schedule, and we work with authors to help them prepare their manuscripts for publication. Each journal has, standards for publication. We have to have the right style, and the graphics have to meet certain standards, and that's where we come in and we help the authors. A misconception about you might have about managing editors is that we don't determine the editorial direction of a journal. We don't make decisions. We work with editors. They're the professionals. They handle the material, and they're the ones that make the decisions. The managing editors, we are interested in publishing high quality work. We're very sympathetic to the needs of authors, and we're happy to answer questions. So, and I think this holds for any journal. If you ever have a question about the quality of your research, if it's a good fit for the journal, it's always a good idea to reach out to the journal, find the managing editor, and send them the abstract and say, hey, is this a good fit for your journal? I get emails every day from authors asking if their research is a good fit. So before you go through the process of preparing all your material for a journal and only to find out that actually they don't publish in that, just write to the managing editor and say, hey, does this look like the kind of thing you publish? And hopefully they say yes. We would love to see that in our journal. Please go to our website and send it to us. And it'll save you a lot of time if that's not the case. So managing editors, my background is in literature. I know a lot about plants just because of what I've learned over the last decade and a half. But sometimes managing editors know about it. They're employed by the society, say, and sometimes they don't. But they know, most importantly, they know people who have the answers. And so if they don't have the answers themselves, they can put you in touch. All right, so the next slide is an example of an article that we published a few years back, just around COVID. And I think it's good journals are epistemologically ecumenical. By this, I mean that we are, let's see, we're open to a variety of information, research from different perspectives, diverse types and sources of data. This is an example of straightforward field research that built on an earlier paper that reported the effects of road dust on pollination and seed set, that in the process, it had some interesting results, and they raised some interesting questions. So they followed up this work with 4 seasons, doing research, going out in the field, not using high technology, but actually going out into the field. And, it's good classic pencil and paper ecology. And it sought to identify the effect of herbivory, or the lack thereof, on the dynamic between the dust and the seed set. The thing I like about this is that it involves veteran researchers from California and doing work in the Rockies in Colorado, but they got the assistance of very young researchers. These are first generation scientists, undergraduates from the Los Angeles, California, and they do some quality research. It's solid research that's important, even if it's incremental, and the findings help expand our knowledge of this plant reproductive biology. So it's it gets people doing research without high technology. It's a collaborative, and it's cited in big journals, in the Journal of Ecology, in the Journal of Spatial Analysis and Environmental Hazards, and Annals of Botany. So big hitting journals. It impacts, and a broad spectrum of journals, and these people went on as undergraduates to be scientists in their own right. So this is the kind of thing that, even if it's a limited impact, it is important to plant sciences, and that's the kind of thing that we embrace. So that's the extent of my talk, and so I'll go hand the baton to the brains and a vision of the journal, Chris Caruso.
Thanks, James. So yeah, before I get into the editor-in-chief role, I did want to point out that IJPS is published by the University of Chicago Press, which is a nonprofit press, and so that's a really important distinction. As we all know, there's a lot of conversation about publishing and the money that goes into it, and the money that authors have to pay, and all of that. And we are really fortunate for over 100 years now, well over 100 years, to have been published by a traditional nonprofit academic press. And, because of that, not only, do they support obviously people like James to do work on the journal, all the production staff behind the scenes that help copy edit and, make the articles, look the best they can be. We also don't have any page charges. Color is free. We're able to do a lot because of that. And not every journal is like that. And that's one of the many reasons, besides that I get to work with James, that, and Juliana and all the folks involved with this, that, I keep on doing this, is I feel that, we actually have the support to, we can't be everything to everyone, but we do have the support to be able to, if people send us good work from anywhere, to be able to publish it at no cost to them, and, and to offer really high quality production. So I just wanted to make sure that it didn't get lost in the shuffle. So editor-in-chief. And so I just wanted to start out by talking a little bit about what the editor-in-chief does, because I think it was well into my career before I actually really understood what an editor-in-chief was. And also I find that sometimes people get a little confused about what is a managing editor and what is the editor-in-chief. And so, unlike the managing editor, the editor-in-chief is really all about the science. So that's the person that really helps set the scientific direction for the journal, and and really focus on setting that agenda, deciding what areas we can publish in, what areas maybe we can't, for a variety of reasons, because no journal can do everything, I guess, unless you're scientific reports or something like that. Traditionally, journals didn't try to do everything. So that's the big distinction, is the focus on the science. And I would say at IJPS, I actually went through this and I kind of ran out of space. I would say, I think this is true for most editors-in-chief, but we tend to be kind of jack of all trades. We do all kinds of things. As James mentioned, we get pre-submission inquiries, right? We get people who say, I have this paper, I'm working on this. Could this be something that would work for the journal? You know, we look at the submitted papers to decide whether they should be rejected without review. And as James said, that's often just because we don't have an editor to handle them or something like that. Or whether they should go ahead and be assigned to someone like Juliana to look at and to hopefully send out for review. Recruit editors. So people like Juliana, I help recruit as we have people who leave the board and we need new people. Setting editorial policy. So how do we handle different things? How do we handle a conflict of interest? You know, how do we you know, basically decide, okay, what sort of decision for a paper? Is this a minor revision? Is it a major revision? Does it need to be reviewed again? How do we kind of make those decisions just about how to do the reviewing process? So I set that policy. You know, I reach out to potential authors to try to convince them to submit their work to the journal if I think they're doing interesting work. I handle appeals, which doesn't happen a lot, but you know, if you get a decision from a manuscript and you feel that it is an error, you can appeal, and that's one thing that I will ultimately end up doing, is handling those. Editors-in-chief also have to handle investigating allegations of scientific misconduct. That doesn't happen a lot, but we have had it happen one time since I've been with the journal. And so, you know, I handled that process. And I also, and not all editors-in-chief do this, but I do, handle promoting the journal on social media. And so, you know, one thing that I really pride ourselves in doing is that, you know, we have a policy of basically trying to promote all the papers that we publish. And we're fortunate that we don't publish so many that we can't do that, but you know, not playing favorites, right? So you know, we try to get the word out there about everyone's paper because you know, we want people to read our authors' work, and you know, it's a chance for us to, you know, lift up people at all career stages. So yeah, so the editor-in-chief does many things. Unlike the managing editor-in-chief is pretty much always a working scientist. So I'm a faculty member at a university. And I do my editorial work, you know, really on top of that day job. I do get an honorarium, and a lot of editors-in-chief do, but it's a little different than the managing editor who actually works for whoever the press is, whoever's publishing the journal, or maybe the society that publishes it. So so I do this on top of other things, which means if you don't hear back from me immediately, that's probably why, is that I'm doing my day job in addition to this. But having said that, I love doing the work, and I think most people who do this kind of work, you know, we don't do it for the glory or the money, but because we really enjoy you know, helping people, you know, improve their papers, and get their work out there. Next. Okay, so what kind of papers at IJPS? So some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is going to be very general advice. Some of it's going to be more specific to IJPS. But just to reinforce some of what James said, you know, at IJPS, we do seek to publish papers that, you know, have novel results, new perspectives on topics that are of interest to a pretty broad international community of scientists. So, you know, there are some journals that, for example, specialize maybe in topics that would be are more regionally focused, for example, so not maybe quite as internationally broad of an audience. And there's other journals that maybe focus on perhaps a little more narrowly kind of topic wise. So maybe they only focus on a particular slice of, say, plant biology, like paleobotany. So, you know, we actually try to strive to publish things that are of interest sort of to a broad sort of, you know, broadly geographically in terms of just the scientists who could read it. And we also do publish on a bunch of different topics in plant biology. Certainly there's some areas we do more of than others, but, you know, we cover a pretty broad swath. And so I would say to be competitive for publication, papers do need to address some broader questions or theories in whatever subfield, you know, you're working in: ecology, evolution, paleobiology, botany, you know, systematics. But I do want to say, I don't want this to feel intimidating. You know, we want to address broader questions, but it's okay if the advances that are made by the paper are modest. And it's okay also if the results are not significant. We do publish non-significant results. So next, I just wanted to give an example of what I was, what I mean by this. Thanks, Juliana. So this is actually a paper out of my lab, which I didn't pick to highlight my lab, but because I was familiar with it. So it was an easy one for me to talk about. And so this is a paper that was written by actually, it's based on work done by an undergraduate student who worked in my lab during the pandemic. And she was testing a prediction from theory in the sort of subfield we're working in, which is that there should be a cost of keeping your flower open longer. If you keep it open longer, that should incur some sort of cost because you need to use carbon and water to keep that floral tissue from senescing. And so this is a pretty sort of broad idea in sort of plant reproductive biology. But this paper actually was really just focused on kind of making what I would say quite honestly, and this is work out of my own lab, a sort of modest advance, which is we wanted to see, well, is this cost of keeping your flower open longer, is it greater in flowers that are hermaphroditic and have both, produce both pollen and ovules, than it is for female flowers that only produce ovules. And we had basically a reason to hypothesize this. And so we tested this, and actually our results were not significant. We found that there was a cost, but it just didn't differ between these two types of flowers. So, I put this out here as an example of a paper that is, and I know Juliana's going to go through a really nice example later, but, it's not a huge data set, but it does address a kind of more general question. But it makes a modest advance, and it actually isn't significant. And this is something that we would be totally happy to publish. So I guess I want to make it clear that I think sometimes when we talk about papers that are of broad interest, it can feel very intimidating or just like an impossible challenge. And I just wanted to put this out there as, one example of the fact that, it really doesn't have to be that way. I think the really key thing here is that we are trying to, we framed the paper in terms of a broader question. And, it's okay if then, we don't have a data set that would, be published in Science magazine or Nature or something like that. That's totally fine. Next. Okay, so now I just wanted to talk a little more generally. I mean, a lot of this flows from IJPS, but it's really true for any journal. And in general, James already touched on some of this, but one key first step is just choosing the right journal. And I really put out a lot of this advice because we do get papers from people who that just, we just don't have the expertise to handle and publish. And so, I hate to see that happen to people because obviously they spent some good time submitting to us, and, we just have to say, sorry, we don't have the expertise to handle this. So it is really worthwhile to pick the right journal. But of course, my students always ask me, like, how do you do that, right? Like, how do you know it's the right journal? And so a few things to think about. One is to look at, if you've written the paper, to look at the literature use site and see what kind of journals it was published in. That can be a really good starting point because, I think this is a little bit of an old-fashioned idea now that we have big journals like Scientific Reports that publish sort of everything. But, traditionally journals were almost like, I don't want to say like a chat room or a discussion group, or a Discord, but really a place where a conversation would be going on about science, right? And so to some degree, you kind of want to see if, you're publishing a lot in a certain area. If you're trying to publish in a certain area, where are other people publishing, who are trying to address similar questions, whose work you're citing? That could be a good place for you to try to put your work too, right? Because there's a conversation happening there. It would also mean that the journal has the expertise to, editorially to handle that kind of work. So that can be a good place to look. Another thing to think about is to always look at the about page on the website to understand the scope of the journal. And again, I say this because our about page, has a list of things we don't publish, mainly agriculture and horticulture and natural products, but we still get those. And so it's really worth looking and just checking before you send it in. Again, not so much for us, but just for you as an author, right? You don't want to waste your time. You can also look at freely available papers that were recently published in the journal. I understand that, not all, things are paywalled, not everything is available everywhere, but almost every journal has at least some freely available content these days. And so that can be worthwhile too, is to look at those papers and just try to see like, okay, is this similar to what I am trying to find a home for? Another important thing, look at the journal's editorial board to see if it includes scientists in your subfield, right? Do you see people who, maybe you've heard of their work, or it's clear, we have a whole Meet the Editors page that has a description of what everyone specializes in. Do you see people who are working in similar areas to you? That, can be a really good way to figure out if the journal is a good place to try to send your work. And the last thing is you are always welcome to send the editor-in-chief, or as James said, the managing editor. We'll send stuff back and forth if we have questions, but, send a pre-submission inquiry to determine if your paper could be a good fit. Like, I'm always happy to respond to those and let people know, either, yes, definitely, no, unfortunately not, or okay, we might be able to handle this, but here's maybe some advice on how you would need to, frame the data and, how you would need to approach it in order for it to be a good match for us. So those are all ways you can, different ways you can kind of try to figure out whether, you've got the right journal for your work. And again, it really is, it's a matchmaking process in a lot of ways. So, that's the important way to think about it. Not in terms of being a gatekeeper. Most of what we end up rejecting, without review is not because we're trying to be gatekeepers. It's just because, it falls outside of our remit of what we publish, because we do a lot, but we don't do everything. And so, that's really where the vast majority of those decisions come from. Okay, next, please. So seeking constructive feedback for submission, always really important. And there's a lot of ways to do this that don't cost any money, because, I certainly don't have money, for example, to pay for professional editing of my papers. It's just not something that I have, that I can do. I occasionally do it for a grant once every 5 years, but otherwise I need to save my pennies for other things. And I certainly have more resources than many. So what are some ways, that don't cost money to get constructive feedback before submission? I see, yeah, I think I edited some slides together here, but that's okay. Some of this is also just about developing some of your own kind of self-editing skills. So one is certainly asking mentors and colleagues to read drafts of your paper. I know that's easier said than done because everyone's really busy, but it can be really helpful if you can, if you're willing to reciprocate, if you can find people to read your papers, that there's really no good substitute for that. Another is just to organize some sort of peer writing in progress group at your institution. So that's really kind of a mutual aid sort of, situation where, everyone gets together and, different people will bring a paper that they're working on and everyone will read it to give feedback. And then the next time someone else will bring one of their papers. And, that's a good way to create a supportive atmosphere, get a lot of feedback from a lot of different people. And, it can also be a great way to, develop some of your own skills in terms of just reading and noticing kind of, what sort of approaches work and what don't. If one paper is really clear and, feels very compelling to you, it can be a good way to help figure out sort of why that might be. There are some society published journals, and I did want to highlight this because I'm actually on the editorial board of other journals when I'm not editor-in-chief. I really do like editorial work, but some of them do offer free writing support. So for example, I'm most familiar with the journal Evolution, which is published by the Society for the Study of Evolution, and they have a whole program called EELS, where they will actually match you up with volunteers who are members of the society to just help, provide feedback and, really provide just some, language support for people who clearly have really interesting data, but could use a little bit of extra assistance on turning that into a compelling story, right? That evolution could accept. So I know this isn't the only one, but it's the one I know of. But free programs like that are worth taking advantage of. There's also free online resources. I don't want to speak for anyone's university that I'm not at, but my university actually has a whole freely available Writing in the Sciences website. It was actually funded by a grant from our national granting agency, and it has some really nice freely available advice. And so a lot of universities have writing centers that offer this, and you don't, like, I know for a fact that our site, you don't have to be at our university or be logged in to access it. So there's a lot of, and I tried to really focus here on resources that, are freely available. That's out there also. Next. So, and I guess I think if one of the pieces I had on the previous page maybe could have gone here, but that's okay. It's worth working to develop good self-editing skills. So, one key self-editing skill is to, and I know we'll be sharing these slides later, so I provided a link to a article that talks about this, but do, writing with the reader in mind. This is a real kind of skill to cultivate, but, we all tend to write for ourselves because we know what we want to say and we're our own most appreciative audience, let's be honest. And, it's a real switch to start thinking about, who's going to be reading this? What do they need to know? Do they need to know it in this paragraph or later? What do they need to know maybe at the beginning of the paragraph for the rest to make sense? So I've linked here to an article that talks about how to approach writing from the reader in mind, with the reader in mind. But certainly I know for myself, this is something I didn't start consciously doing until maybe a little over 10 years ago, and it's really made a big difference in my writing, and I'm certainly an evangelist for it, but it's a good skill to develop, and will make a big difference in your writing. So again, I linked to an article there, and I know we're going to share these later. That's worth looking at, freely available article also. So the other thing is, good writing is made, not born, or born, yeah, made, not born. I'm sorry, it's late here. But so, there really is no substitute for writing and then editing and doing more writing and editing again and letting it sit and editing more. And, I know from personal experience, being a working scientist myself who publishes, that this is a lot. But if you can kind of embrace doing that, it will really make a big difference in the final product. Also, it makes it easier to get started because you realize, okay, I can write this and it's not going to be great initially, but I can make it better, right? And that will really just can make it easier to move forward, especially, and we all face this with writing sometimes, when we just feel kind of overwhelmed by the task at hand. Have a growth mindset with respect to writing. I mean, I certainly tell my students that I'm an editor-in-chief. I'm pretty gray haired now, and I'm still kind of improving my writing, and we all have room to improve. And so I think, that's helpful too, to think of that we're all learners and we're all trying to get better. Will make it a lot easier to kind of be able to develop the kind of self-editing skills. And I would just finally leave something with a note to just be cautious about using generative AI to improve writing. I'm not saying it's impossible or that it's not a tool that you should take advantage of, because I don't think any tool is uniformly bad or uniformly great. But AI can hallucinate. It will make things up, including citations, and that's the last thing you want to send off to a journal. And also, I guess, I don't know, to some degree, writing is thinking. And so I think it's tempting to use AI to maybe try to shortcut the process, but I think in some ways it can also, I'm not sure in the end if it can really do that, because, ultimately, to get where you want with your writing is going to take a lot of thinking, and you can't really outsource that, even though at times all of us who write would love to outsource it, because most of us don't like writing so much as we like having written. We like the feeling of getting there, but not necessarily the process. But so I would just be cautious with it, because I do think it could really cause you to end up putting in material that is just wrong and hallucinated by the AI. But also I don't know what to say. It in the long run, it may kind of slow down your improvement in your skills by relying on it. So that's probably my most personal take here, of what to think about. And so is that my last slide, Juliana? No, I have another one. Thank you. And yeah, it's definitely, last thing I wanted to talk about was just about, once you submit and once you get reviews back and comments from the editor, I would say first off, and this is, I think, a hard thing for all of us to do, because our paper, we tend to be very invested in it, and it can be very hard to get feedback on it, and not feel somewhat irked at the people who sent that feedback. I think that's just human. But, I do think it's important to realize that, editors and reviewers, are really invested in helping you improve your paper. I mean, editors are, get paid nothing to provide some feedback on your paper, and editors often get paid nothing, or maybe a tiny little pittance of an honorarium or a free registration at a meeting. So, they really are invested in helping you improve your paper. I mean, when I get a paper to handle or to review, I mean, I want it to be good, right? Like, I am rooting for the authors, and I want it to be, a good paper, and I want to help make it better. So, just, and this can, sometimes you have to step away for a week from the reviews, but just try to avoid being adversarial. You can disagree, that's totally fair. And I'll get to that in a minute, but being overly adversarial isn't really gonna get you very far with editors or reviewers. You do want to respond to every point in the review, and that can feel sometimes like you're pushing a giant boulder up a hill, but it really is worthwhile to do that, to not try to skip any of those points. I would say too, you don't have to agree with everything in a review, but you do have to constructively engage with the feedback, right? That's one thing I try to teach people who I work with is, you can disagree, but you need to some degree think like, okay, I disagree with this comment, but like, the reviewer or the editor made it for a reason. So why are they making this comment, right? And sometimes it's just that you wrote something and you meant it to mean one thing, and the editor or the reviewer is taking a completely different meaning from it, right? So they have some comment that doesn't make any sense to you because, there's basically some miscommunication in there. And so, that's the kind of thing that's worth thinking about. You're under no obligation to agree, but I do certainly, when I read responses, I want to see that people have tried to engage with the criticism and have tried to make some sort of response and made some effort to understand where the reviewer or editor is coming from. So I think that's important. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if there's a whole ton of comments from a reviewer, and the authors are just disagreeing with every single one and not doing anything, it does raise some red flags for me, really, because again, there's some reason that comment was made, and it just may suggest that a little more thought needs to be put in to responding. And the final thing is, don't hesitate to reach out to the editor with questions. If certainly when I write decision letters, and I would say we generally encourage this amongst editors in the journal, we try to actually not just send back a form letter, but say, okay, we got 2 reviews, and maybe like these are the most important comments that the reviewers made, or we try to give you some feedback of our own, but also some indication of maybe what's the most important things you really need to be focused on addressing here. But sometimes you'll get reviews back or a decision back, and you'll just have questions about like, okay, this query came up, but you have some sort of question about it, and just don't hesitate to ask to reach out. I mean, editors are there to help address some of these questions, so we really do want to help. And I do believe that is the end of my slides. Yes, I was right.
Yes, it is. So we wanted to pause and let James and Chris answer any questions since it's late. They are going to have to leave in just a little bit. So we wanted to stop, answer questions for a bit, and then I will do the last part of the talk. So I don't know if anybody has a verbal question or written question. We'll just take a pause for a minute.
Yes, we
There's a-
have someone raising a hand, I guess.
Great.
Hang on. Yes, please. Oh ya, Pak Jamas ya, silakan.
Okay, thank you for the moderator and the speakers. Let me introduce myself. My name is Nailul. I'm from Research Center for Horticulture at BRIN. One question I want to ask is about the topic. Must we have an original topic or idea, or can we modify it from the current or older research like that?
I mean, I would say that all research really builds on work that's already been done. So, I think that would be fine. And this would certainly be something where, if you have some concerns, you could always, reach out to someone like, myself or James or the managing editor or EIC, wherever you're going, and just, with a quick question about like, okay, I've done this, would that be appropriate? But, most research builds on other research. So I would say rarely is that going to be a big concern. I don't know if James has anything to add.
Okay.
Nope. I see the no.
Okay, it's clear for me. Thank you for the answer.
No problem.
Ada yang lain? Anyone else, please? Well, I guess I have a question about about handling appeals and allegation. I'd like to hear about it. I mean, I don't hear too many. I probably never hear about like scientific misconduct or something here. So probably you have anything to share with us about it?
Sure. So, I mean, I would say that it, I mean, we have not seen a lot of it. Clearly, there are some subfields where there's quite a bit. There's whole websites like Retraction Watch that track sort of retractions and scientific misconduct and such. Not all retractions are obviously because of misconduct. Sometimes there are genuine errors, but but we in my time at the journal, and I don't know, James has a longer span than I have, but we've only had one allegation, and that was someone sent us an email with making a claim about a paper that we had published. And so we're actually bound. There's a whole basically organization called the Committee on Publication Ethics, which COPE is the abbreviation. And so they basically have, like, journals like ours are what are called COPE signatories. We basically agree to sort of meet certain ethical standards for publication. And so one thing they have is guidance for what do you do in the case where this happens? Like, how do you do an investigation? And I think they can look really differently, but in our case, the allegation was about a paper that's not in my subfield, so I couldn't evaluate the scientific claims myself because it's just not, it's too far from what I study. So we got a member of our board and basically sent them the kind of claim that was made, you know, the allegation, and sent them a copy of the papers about which the allegation was made. And we didn't tell them who had made the allegation. We just left it anonymous and asked them to, you know, could they evaluate it, basically? Like, could they read the original papers, read the allegation, and make you know, come to a decision? And they have real expertise in the area. So that was how we ended up handling it. And they found no grounds for the allegation. And so we let the person who brought the allegation forward, you know, basically let them know that. So yeah, I basically went to the COPE website, and they have a whole, like, a flow chart on how do you handle these things, and, you know, tried to do it in a way that, you know, I felt, yeah, that sort of met those standards, you know, ethically, because we did have an obligation to investigate any credible claim. But yeah, and so that was how we did it. It was an interesting experience, can I say, to do that. But we are seeing more of it, but not a whole lot at our journal yet. But yeah, we have ways to handle that should it ever happen.
Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. Okay.
Did you want to
If
know
it,
about appeals or no?
yes, yes, yes.
Appeals,
Is
yeah.
it
So
different then?
yeah, appeals happen more often, and yeah, quite different. So appeals are when, you know, we
Oh,
make a
really?
decision. Yeah. And no, I mean, not super frequent, but I guess more than the one scientific misconduct allegation I've had. So I don't know. Yeah, more than that, but not that common. It's true. But usually what that is when, you know, well, it's when we reject a paper and the authors feel that the rejection is not warranted. And so, you know, which is totally fair. I mean, that's a fair thing to do. And so what happens then at our journal, and we have this written down as policy, because I think that's important that you're not freelancing it, you have a policy, is that, you know, for example, say this happened with a paper where Juliana, as editor, rejected a paper and there was an appeal. And basically the way it works at our journal is Juliana would first look at the appeal and basically say, okay, do I think there's any grounds for this, right? And maybe she would decide, like, okay, this isn't a rejection, you know, so maybe we'll make it a major revision, or maybe we'll make it a reject, but you can resubmit, right? As opposed to just a flat reject, we won't look at a revision. So she could decide that. And sometimes that happens. I've been the editor at various journals at least a couple of times where I've been like, okay, I see your point here, you know, perhaps, you know, a different decision would be warranted. I would say more often we decide that no, the original decision really is the best decision. And, you know, in which case you know, someone like Juliana would need to write a letter back, basically saying, okay, I understand your points here, but for these reasons, we still feel that this decision of a rejection is warranted. And then if they appeal again, say they're unhappy still, they disagree perhaps again, then it would go to me as editor in chief. And then, you know, I essentially would do the same thing. I'd look at everything, the original paper, all the back and forth, and then I would make a decision. That doesn't happen that often, that it actually makes it up to me. But yeah, so we have a process for it. You know, it's not super common. Pretty much everyone who appeals It's very sex biased. It's mostly men. I know that's true at other journals too, from talking to managing editors. Women, we don't tend to appeal, but men do, which is very interesting. But yeah, we have a process for it, and it's certainly something you can do. I mean, you know, it's you know, as long as you're respectful about it, I think it's fine. And like I've never appealed a paper in my life, a decision in my life, but people do. So and it's certainly something to be aware of. But I think I see another hand up.
Yes. Before James, do you have anything to add about
Yeah, you've seen a lot. That's a good point. I should have
Or-
handed it over to
or
James.
allegation?
No, actually, I think Chris, that one incident is the only thing we've had for IJPS. The Consumer Research Journal, we have had some retractions. One thing that we try to encourage is making data publicly available. There are certain repositories, independent repositories like Dryad or Dataverse, where certain kinds of data lend themselves to reproducibility. And so we encourage authors to make those data available, either the computer code that was used to generate the data, or the data, it's the raw data itself. They could be posted online and shared. We some of the stuff we do, we just kind of bundle up in the appendices and make available as part of the article. But sometimes we encourage actually authors to put them on in repositories. And that's something that a lot of, especially high impact journals like Science and Nature, that kind of can determine whether or not you get a promotion, they are mandating that these kinds of studies are verified before they're even conducted, and that the data has to be supplied to the journal with the submission. We don't do that with IJPS. Some of the material can be published, and some of it is just published in the article itself. But fortunately, we haven't had that kind of problem at all, really, with IJPS. If in that case with Chris, it was just kind of a matter of interpretation of the material, and really not with the quality of the data. So yeah.
Thank
But
you,
yeah, I mean,
James.
our fellow University of Chicago Press Journal, I mean, the American Naturalist has had several rounds of academic misconduct allocations to authors who published quite a bit. So it does happen, but yeah, it is true. We have not had a ton. And in that case, they were, there were retractions in both cases. So yeah.
Quite a bit. Okay, move on to the next question, probably. Ipit, silakan.
Thank you very much, Vita. I just wondering because nowadays there is a lot of scientific journal, international scientific journal. So how do as a author to know if the journal is good or bad? Because sometimes there is a journal monthly publish a lot of papers, and then sometimes there is a journal also that's quite only biannual or just once a year. So how do we know what are good papers? And then the second question that I wondering about the time the journal handle the paper start from the submission until it's published, because sometimes there is no statement in the journal itself. Sometimes there is a very fast journal published in the paper published in the journal, but sometimes there is a lot of time for a manuscript that under review. It's sometimes it's until a year still under review, and so how do we as an author decide if we want to distract or recall our paper? Thank you very much.
So James,
Thank
for the
you,
second half of that, did you want to about sort of submission times? And because we've
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really good question because there are lots of very questionable journals out there. They're very dubious. We call them predatory journals. They will take your material, they'll take your money, and they'll publish it on their website. They have very fancy looking websites, and they'll publish anything for a fee. And you want to watch out for those. We we do peer review all of our articles are seen by at least 2 reviewers. They're handled by a scientific editor, and we try to get them out in the time to first decision is usually about 50 or 60 days. It could be longer because, like Chris says, our editors are in the field, the reviewers, they're scientists. There are busy seasons a lot in the summertime here in the United States. It's hard to find reviewers, so it can take a longer time to get the reviews in, to get those first decisions. But generally, it only takes about 5 or 6 months to get a manuscript from first submission to final revision or to get it ready to publish. It shouldn't take much longer, and it shouldn't be too fast, right? If you get reviews back pretty quickly, that might send a bad signal. If it's quality, if you get quality feedback from reviewers, that's really good. But you definitely, I've heard of people who submit manuscripts and they get a decision without any kind of reviews, and that should be a alarm. You shouldn't be giving having to pay for something like that. And at IJPS, we said quality reviews, we get revisions, we might send it out for re-review, and we don't charge any money because we're not for profit and by the University of Chicago Press. So we don't do it super fast, but we don't take a very long time either.
Because I know we've gotten some papers like that one at Conservation Genetics where they were just taking forever and the authors eventually just pulled the paper, right? Like they couldn't get a decision or any communication, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are seeing more of that, but it is true. There is some truth that if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. But I can really understand that there's been a real proliferation of journals. And I mean, there are other International Journal of Plant Sciences besides us that got set up that we can't really do anything about. And so it can be very murky sometimes. I think that's where, again, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. But where it can even be worth reaching out to colleagues and such to try to get a sense of like, okay, is this legitimate or not? Certainly things like, Committee for Publication Ethics, if they're a signatory on that, if they've got really material on how they do peer review and all of that, like that information, that's also a good sign, right? But I'm actually sympathetic. I think it's gotten way more complicated since I first started publishing. And it seemed like there were, a handful of journals that I, aspired to publish in, and it was pretty clear to me. And I think now I was in a publication workshop at a meeting this summer in Montreal, and I could just, a lot of folks who were younger were just really just didn't have, like, we're confused, and I get it. There's so many places now. So
that's it. In summary, that you said that in general, the time needed is about 6 months, right? From the submission to the publish.
It
6
could take
months.
a little bit longer, and if it gets amazing reviews, it could be even shorter.
Now that's why I'm wondering also, because also we all depend to the reviewer, right? If the reviewer took a long time to review, is it okay if the author just asks, because it's still under review, and under review again? Because my colleagues have experience that until 3 years it's still under review. So what should
Oh
we
my
do?
God.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
happened. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not right. That shouldn't be like that. It is very hard to get reviewers these days, but like it should not be anything like that. And the other thing I would say is you should also, if you reach out saying, okay, can you update me on the status of my paper? Like you should get a pretty prompt response. That's also, I think, if people are just not responding, that's a really bad sign. But yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. But yeah, I agree. It shouldn't be like that. I don't know if you want to add something, James.
No, you're exactly right, Chris. I mean, we've had authors, people approach me at conferences saying, hey, listen, we submitted to the journal, we haven't heard back. We don't even know if it's out for review. Is this something you'd consider? And I looked at it, and sure enough, it looked like it would be a good fit for us, and we took care of it, and we ended up publishing it. I think any kind of conscientious journal should treat manuscripts authors with respect, and that means moving things in a timely fashion. You can always write to the managing editor and say what's going on. And people write to me all the time, say, I haven't heard from you, and I'm happy to say, well, we have one reviewer, but we need another one, and it's moving along. And that's all authors need to know is that we are working on it, and we'll have a deadline. And you should be able to get that kind of response from the journal. And if you don't, then someone wrote, says, is it okay to withdraw a paper? You can withdraw a paper at any time. Ideally, if it's been accepted, it's kind of in bad form to withdraw it, because I mean the journal has invested time and resources. They've gone and they've got reviewers, they've got feedback, and they've put some work into it. But if at any point you feel that it's not right, it's not being handled well, if it's too expensive, then it is possible to withdraw your manuscript. It's very rare. I don't know that anybody has ever withdrawn an accepted manuscript. In fact, I don't think anybody's ever withdrawn a manuscript at all. I mean, I think only if the revisions are just like so demanding, they require new data, and they're like, we can't do this, then they can withdraw it. But it's possible to withdraw a manuscript, but that's rare.
Okay, thank you very much. One question, please. Oh, sorry. Did the managing editor or the editor give the deadline to the reviewer, or just wait to the reviewer until it finishes?
Oh, so sort of what's the flow here? So I think hopefully I understood it correctly. So I think the question is, so like
I
sorry,
guess do you set the time boundary for a reviewer to return the review?
yes, we do. I think we give people, 3 weeks now, just because anything less than that feels pretty inhuman. But we do. But well, it's just everyone's busy. I mean, I get review requests and they're like 7 days, 14 days, and I'm like, I'm already scheduling into next month. Like, I pretty much always have to ask for an extension. So, we do that. And, some people will get them in early. That totally happens. But yeah, we do that. But it has gotten, and I think, and it's not just our journal, it's every journal. It's found it really hard to get reviewers these days. It's hard to get people, and people are less likely to be on time. So we do send out reminders. We do try to goose people along and do various things to kind of get those 2 reviews that we need. And most, like, when it works well, it's all great. And occasionally papers will really struggle. And it's nothing about the papers. It's just some bad luck sometimes. So I don't know if you want to add anything, James. Nope.
No.
We really do our best to try to, keep things moving. So, because that's certainly our goal, because, we want to get people an answer too, as much as they want an answer. But yeah, sometimes, you know, we really have to chase after reviewers.
I mean, I think that you after submission and somebody asks, you know, how long should you know whether it's been rejected or accepted? I mean, it should be sent out for review within you know 2 or 3 weeks of being submitted, right? So you should be able to write, you know, and the system we use is called Editorial Manager. And after you submit, you can track the progress. You can see if the editor still has the manuscript. If it's been sent out for review, it will change the status that it says it's been sent out for review. After the reviews have been completed, the author will get a notification that says they've been completed. And very often I'll get an email from the author. They'll see that the reviews have been complete and it's back with the editor. And they're like, what's going on? You know, do you have a decision? And I'll say, yeah, we'll have a decision for you very soon. We just got it back. But you should definitely know whether there's hope for your submission within 3 or 4 months. I mean, there's no harm in writing to the managing editor and say, you know, hey, how are things going? I haven't heard from you in a while. And the managing editor should be able to give you some sort of update and some idea of how things are going. But if you don't hear from a journal after 6 months after submission, that's kind of a red flag. You know, something's not right there.
So the gap is 6 months. Should be more cautious then. It should reach out to the editor. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Any more questions before these two probably must leave because already late there? Silakan Bapak Ibu, ada lagi?
Yeah, should we go on to the last part and then I can take more questions at the end?
I guess so.
Does that sound good?
Yep.
All right. So, I just wanted to mention, I love this discussion. I never got to hear all this stuff about editors and editorial process as a graduate student, and I think this is really good education. And it was actually when I was a graduate student that IJPS was first mentioned. We were in a group that was working together to publish a paper that had been abandoned by another graduate student. And it was mentioned that IJPS was a great home for really good work. And you know what? I've been really proud to be an author in this journal, and I'm really proud to be an editor. So thanks, guys. With that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my sort of viewpoint on how to write a great paper. So this is a topic that I really love, and that is storytelling, and how you can use storytelling to really craft a paper that I think Chris said, a paper that is for the reader. And this is a storytelling makes your paper for the reader. So you want to build a story with the sections of your manuscript when you're writing a paper. And sometimes people say, well, Juliana, you're writing a story. Isn't that, you don't want to make anything up. Well, we're talking about using storytelling techniques to tell a nonfiction story. So what I want to do is I want to use this old Aesop's Fables, The Fox and the Grapes, just as a little example of how you use storytelling to tell a nonfiction story. So on the left, I have the Aesop's Fables, and then on the right, I have what is Aesop's Journal of Ecology. So if we could turn Aesop's Fox and the Grapes into a real scientific paper, it would be something along the lines of talking about foraging time of foxes. So what I want to story and show you how this technique works. So The Fox and the Grapes is basically a very old tale, and it's a pretty simple tale. And the key to the storytelling technique is that you're going to use the idea that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And this is important because this is how the human brain actually learns information. is through this arc of storytelling. So in The Fox and the Grapes, the beginning, the exposition is where they tell you what's happening. And in the beginning, the fox is in a meadow and he sees some grapes. So that's sort of the setting. Then there's a conflict in the story, and the conflict in this story is that the fox wants to eat the grapes, but he can't reach them. So they're high up. He's trying to jump. Then they have in the story what they call the rising action, where it's starting to get exciting, and you're like, ooh, this is getting really interesting. So the fox can't get the grapes, so he jumps to try to get the grapes. And then the climax is really sort of the aha moment, the big moment of the story. The fox still can't reach the grapes no matter how hard he tries. And then they have what they call the falling action, which is sort of the end of the story. And in this case, the end of the story is that the fox decides that the grapes are not delicious anyway. And the resolution is that he walks away and he doesn't ever eat any grapes because he thinks they're sour grapes. So this is a very simple example of a complete story. And what I want you to take away from this is the idea that if you take away one of these elements that I just told you, you're actually going to have a hard time understanding what happened in the story. So if I forgot to tell you that the fox was jumping to get the grapes, when I come to this climax point and I tell you the fox still can't reach them, you're confused. You're like, wait a minute, I didn't know the fox was jumping. So the same thing is actually true in a scientific paper. And the idea is that with a scientific paper, the story gets so complex that actually it becomes really critical for your reader that you very carefully follow the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story for them in a very logical way that helps them see all the parts of the story. So now I'm going to move from my Aesop's Fables to my little fake version of what the Aesop's Fables science paper would be. And we're going to call it The Foraging Time of Foxes Depends on Perceived Grape Quality, Not Grape Nutrient Contents. So now you see it's science. So my story has gotten a lot more complex. There's a lot more factors, but I actually still have the same arc of the story. So in the introduction of your paper, what you're going to do is you're going to set the stage. You're going to tell people that grapes are a nutritious part of the fox's diet, right? Foxes like grapes. They want to eat them. The conflict is that access to grapes is actually limited. Foxes' energy to forage grapes is limited. You're going to tell them that foxes might actually forage longer. This is your theory, that they might actually forage longer for more nutritious grapes. Makes sense, right? Then you might present data on fox foraging time versus grape nutrient contents. And then you're still going to have the falling action and the resolution where you tell us, well, what happened? Well, the foraging time of foxes was not aligned with grape nutrient context. Those grapes looked really good, but the fox didn't keep getting them. And that's the resolution of the story. So we can conclude that foxes appear to use criteria other than nutrient contents to determine the grape's quality, which impacted their foraging time. And we end in a paper with the future work, which we think should investigate the criteria this fox used to determine his grape's quality. So I think this is a cute and sort of a silly example, but you really make the point, because if I went over and I took out this information about foxes might forage longer, none of this story makes sense to my reader. So when you're going to write your papers, I encourage you to build an outline of your story that basically has all of these elements. So what I want to do is I want to go through the introduction, methods, results, and discussion, and just give you a little bit more details about how you craft these elements of your story. So in the introduction, the first thing you want to do is you really want to use this funnel structure. The introduction starts with really broad statements, and then it narrows down, and by the end of the introduction, you have very specific questions that you're asking. And the introduction describes the setting and the characters. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's an example of a paper I wrote where the setting was a landscape and we were talking about woody shrub encroachment. So my introduction should start with a bold statement about why that's important. It should start by saying, something along the lines of all over the world, woody shrubs are encroaching into grasslands, and this is detrimental to the biodiversity of the grasslands. So now the reader knows, oh, here I am in a woody grassland, in a grassland with these woody shrubs, and they feel like they understand the setting of the story. Then what you're going to do is you're going to expand that setting to describe these characters. So this is from one of my papers. The characters are your variables. And oftentimes what we see in papers that can be hard for the reader is lots and lots of acronyms. So one of the really nice things you could do for your reader if you need a lot of acronyms is to make a table where you define your acronyms, and those are your characters in your story. This is how the reader is going to know where is the story happening, who is the play, who are the characters in my story. So you build your introduction to introduce these concepts, and at the end, you're going to ask a very specific question, such as, how does the plant water potential of woody shrubs differ on the edge of encroachment versus in the center of the shrub distribution? So you start with a really big picture. Why do we care? Where are we in the world? And you zoom way down into your very, very specific questions. And then now, if you've done that well, the reader is ready for the really detailed methods. Methods are actually one of the hardest parts of a paper to write, and they're the hardest parts of the paper to read and assess. And your best defense as a writer is to just give details. And I really like this picture because what you see is there's a foggy path with all kinds of obstacles. And in the distance, there's this beautiful rock, and I want to get to this rock. It's Conclusions Rock. And there's a lot of ways to get to Conclusions Rock. And if you took this path through the mist and you don't explain to the reviewer how you got there, they're just going to be confused. And you also need to explain to them, why did you choose this path? Because reviewers are invariably going to see other ways, alternative pathways you could have used to answer your question. Did you think about this method? Why didn't you use that technique? Why didn't you measure such and such? So your job as a writer is to make sure we understand why you chose the path you did and to demystify this path. Help us see what's there and why you did it. And as a reviewer and an editor, one of my biggest points where I decide that a paper really can't be accepted is if I can't understand the methods well enough to feel confident in your conclusions. If I don't know how you got to Conclusions Rock, the paper really needs to be returned, and there's not much you can do about it as a reviewer or an editor at that point. So I'll give you an example in a minute of a really good example of this. Results are the other key central core piece of the manuscript where you can really lose your reader through confusion. One of the most important things that reviewers and editors look for is, are your statistical tests appropriate? Did you do the right data analysis? And as a reviewer and an editor, I look at your data structure. So that means, were you using categorical data? Did you have counts? Are you looking at genetics? And that's going to determine what statistical tests are going to be appropriate. I'm also going to try to match your stated objectives or your questions with your statistical tests. So again, I'll give you an example of how you can make sure that reviewers see that match between the tests that you did and the questions that you were trying to answer. The other really thing that becomes critical in the results is presenting things in logical order from basic to complex, and then the idea that the entire manuscript should match. I have a little cute diagram here to illustrate this idea. So in the beginning, you might have a manuscript where you've got all sorts of different types of data. And the data can build sort of from a cellular perspective up to a whole organism perspective. Or the data could build from individual species up to a community. And that's what I've illustrated in this picture. The square represents the most fundamental unit of your research, be that a gene sequence or an anatomical feature. And what you're going to do through the manuscript is you're going to introduce basic ideas and then build on them very clearly a little bit at a time. And each time you add an element, you're going to be very clear about naming things in exactly the same way as you did in the previous part of the manuscript. So oftentimes when you get a manuscript that's hard to review, it has disconnects between the words that are used in the results and the words that are used in the introduction and the discussion. And then as a reader, you're just confused and you're left wondering, are you talking about the same thing here that you were there? And that's really hard to review. So the best thing you can do is just make sure you take a good long look, that you're calling ears throughout the manuscript. You've painted everything in this way that really matches and that goes from basic to more complex. And your reader will thank you for that. All right, last section of the manuscript. You're going to do the opposite of the introduction in a lot of ways. You're going to reverse your funnel. So I'd like to start my discussion with a very basic restatement of what I was expecting to do, maybe 1 or 2 sentences about my objectives, just to remind the reader where we are after we went through all those details of the results. And I also want to make sure that I'm going to avoid excessive speculation. And I know everybody's heard that before, and it's easy to let your heart run away with an interpretation of data. I think I always allow myself to sort of over speculate when I'm writing. And then what I do when I'm editing is I remind myself to focus on the data at hand. Your discussion should really talk about your data that you collected. Oftentimes discussions focus way too much on the literature, and we're not really sure what you have to say about your own data. I encourage especially new science writers to try to put their own ideas into their discussion. That is often something that is lacking from a discussion, is a creative idea. So I think it's better to take a risk speculating a little bit in your data, as long as you stick to the data you have. And as long as you're willing to hone your arguments and change how your discussion is crafted when you get your reviews back. The last thing you really need to do in your discussion, and this is one of the most important things reviewers want to see. They want to see the relevance. Often you'll get a discussion that says, we confirmed X as shown by so-and-so. And that's really not the look you want to have in your discussion. You want to talk about how your work has advanced the conversation. Chris showed a really cool example of a paper that had this no answer. That still advances the conversation. Don't take your paper and say, oh, the results weren't significant or hypotheses were not shown, and think that means it's not relevant. It still has relevance, and it still advances the conversation. And what you want to do is contextualize your work in the broadest way possible. Okay, I need a drink of water. I wanted to end on the right-hand side. I have a graphic that is pulled from the PLOS One website. Helpful out there from universities. And one of the things I do is I encourage people to look at a lot of different types of advice, because your writing process is unique, and the things that you need to do to write a good paper are actually going to be maybe different than the way I can write a good paper. So I encourage you to go to the journals you're interested, look and see if they have advice for writers, because now most of them actually do, the bigger journals do. The last thing I want to do is highlight an interesting paper that I think really shows what I love about International Journal of Plant Sciences and what I value about really, really great journals. In some ways, I have a little red flag over here. And in some ways, this paper has two red flags that someone at a big journal might say, oh, this isn't going to be interesting. Or even a writer might say to themselves, I don't think this is a big paper. A writer might actually undercut their own paper because the outcome was actually neutral and the data is descriptive. Those are two things you will hear in editing and publishing as sort of like, oh, that's not good. Your data shouldn't be descriptive. You shouldn't have neutral or, non-significant results. But what I want to show you with this paper is that is not relevant because this paper really hit home with excellent story structure, excellent connection to theory. They used really clear writing, and that all started right in the beginning of the abstract. So right at the beginning of this paper, the reader is excited, the reader knows why it matters, and the reader understands what's happening. So let me just look at these elements with you and show you how they did that. The first element I really like is that the title gives the main takeaway. It doesn't say the effect of X on Y. It says neutral interactions dominate. We know actually what the whole message of this paper is in the title, and that's going to help you people find your research, but it sets the stage for the reader. Now I'm interested. Now I know if something's going to happen in this paper. The next thing it does is the very first sentence of the abstract is the big picture theory. It basically talks about vascular epiphytes can interact with their hosts and with other epiphytes. That is an ecological theory of community interactions. You can interact with other members of your community. Then they go on to be a little more specific with theoretical elements and a knowledge gap. So what they say is there are no integrative studies that analyze both host epiphyte and epiphyte associations, where there are high abundance of vascular epiphytes, such as cloud forests. So I'm excited now. This is a unique ecosystem. We don't know a lot about it. As a reviewer, I want to have fun reading this paper. And if you can get your reviewer feeling like they're going to have fun reading your paper 2 sentences in, you have just won a big part of that review process. So then they say most studies have described inner associations, but most of them have not looked at different growth forms, reproductive states, and taxonomic identities. So that's basically saying, here's how I'm going to add to the conversation with this study that we're going to do. The last thing in this first part, they end with these clear study objectives. The goal of this study was, that kind of language is really welcome in a paper because I can search through the paper the word goal, and I just found your goal. So using that clear goal, the novelty of the study to state your objectives is excellent. When you look at the methods, as I said, it's descriptive. And there's only 2 sentences. This was not a high-tech paper. So I think the most important thing I want people to understand is your paper does not have to be high-tech, expensive. It doesn't have to represent 1,000 million years of many, many people. What you really need is you need a great data analysis that speaks to theory. In a minute, I'm going to show you how they made that happen. But that is how they turned a descriptive data set into a really excellent paper that was accepted in a great journal. And then in the conclusions, they just drive everything home by emphasizing the novel and the contribution to theory. And I love their language here. They say, our results show the importance and complexity of host epiphyte and epiphyte associations. To our knowledge, this is the first study in which these associations at different reproductive stages and growth forms are evaluated. We know immediately that this paper is interesting, that it's novel, and how it fits in the big picture of things that people care about internationally. So it's a place-based study, but it feels international to me. So right off the bat, as a reviewer and editor, I'm excited about this paper. The next place where the rubber really hits the road in review is in your methods, as I stated. And I hinted at this, the analysis is what transformed this paper from a purely descriptive paper into what people sort of call a question-based paper. So in my science training, question-based, that theory connection is really viewed as the higher level of scientific papers. So what you see at the very beginning of the methods is there is a clear match of the theory and the goals that were stated previously to the tests. So they say things like to infer the assembly mechanism. Well, we know they're talking about assembly mechanisms. So now I'm like, ooh, now I know how they're going to do it. I'm not going to go through this. This is an extensive, this is all analysis description. It's over a page and a half. Do not be afraid to write down your methods in detail, especially when people are new. They get worried that people aren't going to like their methods. But the reality is good reviewers and good editors are not looking to reject your paper based solely on the fact that you didn't do what they would have done. They want to see that what you did is good for answering your question and that it's appropriate. And if there's a way that what you did could be slightly changed, you want to know that because you're going to have a better paper for it. So I encourage you, be detailed in your methods. Don't worry about someone seeing what you did because that's the way to get the better advice that you need. And one of the things that I really like is what you can do in your self-editing is go through and look for places where you think you're going to get tripped up and give them the reasoning behind your choices. Sometimes we make a choice because that's all we have. So one of my greatest training in biology was getting to work with paleobotanists and finding out that some papers have an N of 1 because sometimes you only have one fossil in the world. So for people who are in things like evolutionary biology, where having one sample is completely ridiculous, you could never publish a paper with one sample. There are plenty of circumstances where not having the perfect data is acceptable because these are the only data that exist, and we are making an advance in science. So giving your reasoning behind why you had to make a choice can be a really effective way to help reviewers understand and accept the results that you are presenting them as valid. And it doesn't hurt to go through and account for potential cofactors. So I wanted to just highlight this. This says it has been stated that the number of epiphytes hosted by a particular species might be influenced by tree size. So a bigger tree might have more epiphytes. That's something that a reviewer could complain about. But what they did is they went and said, to control for this, we conducted a separate analysis. What you see in this is that ends up not being that big of a deal in the paper, but they've addressed this concern that reviewers might have preemptively. And I tend to do this a lot in physiology because maybe you might have to account for something that you didn't think of when you did the study, and you can do that with your analysis. The last thing you want to do is have clear sample size statements and the reasoning behind that. Nothing trips up a reviewer more than you said you have 7 and the figure shows 9. make sure you've got your sample size statements really, really clear, and that the samples that you state in the methods actually matches what I'm going to see in the figures. That's a really key feature. All right. This is my last slide. I personally love figures. It is actually my favorite part of science. It's my favorite part of writing a paper. I have at least 6 papers that have figures and no text right now, because this is where I end up stalling. So one of my specialties is thinking about high quality figures and what they bring to your paper. I love this figure, and the reason I love it is it's a high level summary that speaks directly to the big picture theory, and man, is it easy to read. So what they're showing you is these are different epiphyte species, and on the x-axis is all different kinds of plants that they might be a neighbor with, that they might interact with. The metric tells you the positive or negative of the interaction. So a positive value means that this species, Tillandsia capitata, when it occurs with itself, Tillandsia capitata, it has a positive effect. It likes to be with other members of the same species. And then a negative value means it doesn't like it. And then one really nice feature that they have is this statistical measure. So a great figure shows you whether the effect is significant. So bars that are beyond the size of this line, that's a significant effect. This is a beautiful figure because it summarizes a very large amount of information, and it tells the entire story of the paper without even trying. A reader loves this figure because it really just tells you, yes, look at all these neutral interactions. There's some really big effects, but overall in this cloud forest, if I'm next to somebody else, it doesn't matter to me. That's a cool result. I feel excited about it as a reviewer, and I think that's why this paper is really took a neutral result and a descriptive data set and made it into a great IJPS paper. And I will note, supplements are kind of all the rage these days. I think they're kind of new, to be honest. But I think people used to use supplements a little bit, but I think people use supplements a lot now. And I personally cannot write a paper anymore without a huge supplement. And what this paper did is it simplified the data presentation by putting all of its, quote, basic community survey data, so that information that you would have, standard things about how many and who and all that, and they put that in the supplement, and they drove these big picture theory figures into the main to the main paper. You need those basic data in the supplement so that the reviewers can vet these more complex figures, but by simplifying it by sort of grouping the things. Okay. That is all I have. And what I'd like to do is I want to tell you that I have sent Jasper copies of the presentation and a Word document that have more details on the tips and examples that we covered here. And I just want to encourage you guys to visit our website and consider submitting your great work to us. And with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing, and anybody who has questions, I'd be happy to answer the questions.
Thank you so much, Juliana. You explaining very enjoyable.
Awesome.
Thank you. And that's give us a lot of hope about publishing in higher reputational journal. I guess I have a question first before somebody else.
Great.
The biggest problem is whenever we have a very limited data is how to turn that, to analyze that. So we say looks sophisticated, or it says something with that very limited data. But then what to do with those data then? what kind of analysis and where should we look for what kind of analysis that can be used?
I think question. I think it goes back to looking at the journal that you're interested in. So, for example, there's a great journal that I really love, Ecological Monographs. They love to publish modeling analyses. So to get into that journal, you have to have a lot of data from a lot of years and a lot of sophisticated high-level analyses. And you can look at the analyses they do and the data sets that they have, and you can mirror those. I think IJPS, for us, what we're looking for is we're looking for analyses that speak to that theoretical element. So for me, I think determining what analysis to do is probably the hardest when I'm working through my data. And the way I do that is I read papers in the same area. I look at similar data sets. I'm working on a paper right now that I had done an analysis originally and I left it. And when I came back, I sort of had this new vision to try to be more creative and think about ways that I could add information from databases. So one of the things that a lot of bigger papers are doing now is getting data from public databases. So if you have a small data set, you can beef that up by getting these other types of published data, adding things that you can use as factors in your analyses.
Right.
Yeah, and then the other thing you can do that I have done in my lab is combine data sets. So I took my recent paper has data sets from 11 different students. And we combined 11 different very small data sets. And part of the reason I was able to do that is I basically just designed a project that could take a really long time with really small inputs. And then I just cobbled them together. But I've met people who've done this with data sets that are from the same location. So if you have a field site and you know there are other people working there, you can basically put these two data sets together and that will give you the opportunity to do more sophisticated analyses. The last thing I would suggest is that reaching out to people who have done sophisticated analyses that you're interested in. Sometimes this can be the start of a new collaboration because there are some people who really specialize in analyzing data. So I have a collaborator who he wants people who collect data because what he does is analyze data. And so there just are sort of niche people who've developed. I think it's sort of an element of data analysis becoming a coding endeavor now. So now that there's all sorts of technical coding aspects of it, people really are specializing that. So if you can look for people in your community that are doing sophisticated analysis, it's worth reaching out and saying, hey, I have this data set and I saw what you did. And I was wondering, do you think I could apply this to my data set? I've done that before. And oftentimes they'll say, oh, your data set's a little small, but here's how you might think about it differently. So I don't know, that can give you a bit of a different perspective.
Just a silly question. Is it safe to share your raw data to someone that you're not really know? Hang on.
Is it safe to share your data with someone you don't know? I think that's a great question. I don't think it's safe to share your data with just anybody. So I think if I was going to reach out to somebody about, a data analysis, I wouldn't just send them my data, and I would want to have some vetting before, like maybe a colleague recommended them or something. That's really, good point. Yeah. I don't worry too much about people stealing my data. I guess I have I probably should worry a little bit more about it, but yeah, I would not send my data to the person. I would just reach out about a collaboration, I guess. So, good
So
question.
so we probably could just ask them about their opinion on this kind of data, and perhaps they have idea, and perhaps they have the interest to do something with it. And
Well, what you could do is you could describe the data structure. So the heart of whether or not you can do a different data analysis is based on your data structure. So you could reach out and you could say, I saw the analysis that you did in this paper. You know, I was interested, I have this many samples that I collected, you know, over this time period, and I'm wondering if you think that would be appropriate to apply to my data. So yeah, I would definitely just describe your data sort of qualitatively and ask for help in that way. Good question.
I should stop. We have somebody raising the hand
Oh,
here.
good.
So silakan
Great.
Pak Nailul.
Okay, may I ask another question?
Yes,
Yes, of
please.
course.
Okay. I want to ask about what is the best way to write a journal if our hypothesis, if our result doesn't go along with our hypothesis like that?
That's a great question. So, in my work, I'm often wrong. So I often think of an idea, and then when I do the result, I realize that my hypothesis was not correct. One way you can do this is write it so that you can show how not being correct changes the conversation. Oftentimes you think of something and then you're like, that's not true. And the important thing for you as a writer to do is show us why we care that's not true. You don't want to make it a confrontation. So sometimes people try to say, well, I've broken down the whole field of XYZ. So you don't want to do that. But you can show how that this brings new perspective. And what you need to do is show us how it points us in a new direction. What can we do now that we know that that's not true or that that didn't happen? Another thing that I've been really interested in is the idea of focusing on not the statistical significance, but the clarity. So sometimes we do a study and it's statistically, it's just not clear. And it's not that it's not true, it's just that the data we collected can't tell us the answer to that. And sometimes it's because you didn't realize that that you couldn't really answer the question with the way you designed the study that you did. And in that case, I was trained to go ahead and change your question that you're asking. Ask yourself, what questions can my data answer? That is actually a valid approach to writing a paper. And it sometimes makes, sometimes when I talk to undergrads about this, they get really nervous. They're like, you can't change your hypothesis afterwards. I was like, yes, you can. You could actually write your paper so that you're asking a different question. Because sometimes the data we collected just, it could never answer the question we originally asked. So I think about half the time that I've designed a study, I go, oh, that doesn't exactly answer that question. So I have to kind of reroute what I'm asking. I think for a reviewer, the most important thing is that it's clear to see how the data you have answers the questions you're proposing. So does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I got your explanation. Thank you for the answer.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, Julie.
Comments. Thank you. I'm glad I'm being helpful and that it's understandable. So
So it is normal to change the direction of our paper a bit. So originally we want to answer this question, and this is the outline. But then after we get the data, we get the result of analysis, then we change the course because it's not really answer our original question, isn't it?
Yeah, I have a really good example. I just was working on a paper, and originally the student and I designed this paper to ask the question, how do the anatomical features of a plant determine how the plant functions? And what we didn't understand at the time is that we didn't collect the right data to understand that connection. So when we reached out to our collaborator, they said, sorry, this doesn't answer that. So what do? Do we just throw it in the garbage and say, oh, well, never mind? No. What we did is we said, well, what questions could we answer with the data that we have? And it turned out we could ask questions about how the anatomy relates to the investment in different carbon versus nitrogen and things like that. So it's not disingenuous to retroactively answer different questions once you get your data. Now, what you don't want to do, and I just want to be clear about this, what you don't want to do is cherry pick your data so it answers the question you want to answer. So that's a slightly different thing. You know, going back and saying, look, the study I did really isn't answering my question. What could I answer? That's an honest way to craft your manuscript. But you don't want to go and say, well, let me take these data and answer this question. So what you have to do, the challenge is taking all the data you have and answering what you can with the data you have, no matter how small in advance. And I think that's honestly, you develop that skill over time. So I think I learned that from my advisors. And I learned that from my own data sets. So that's where I think you really need to get with peers and get with those writing groups. It's often been my peers and my co-authors that helped me understand what I could do with my data, you know, where I was kind of messing, you know, going wrong and trying to answer what I could answer with the data. But having a data analysis and a data set that doesn't match the questions that you have in your introduction, that's a fast track to get rejected because it just doesn't make sense to the reviewer. Doesn't match, right? So.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question here in the chat. So the question is from Sri and Topik. What do you think of the idea that we write our manuscript start from the methods first, and the result and discussion last, then the introduction?
That's the way I do. I always write my methods and then I write my results. And then I write an outline of the introduction and then I write my full discussion. So yeah, I think that's the way most people do it. The results are the heart of the manuscript. So you got to get that heart, that core needs to be good and strong, and then you sort of build outward from that. So yeah, that's exactly how I do it.
She said that writing the introduction is really challenging.
It is, yeah.
We need a lot of reading for the introduction.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I like to do for reading for the introduction, this is a tip that I learned a long time ago. I did this tip where I would read only titles of papers. And I would pick any paper that had an interesting title. Then I would have a lot of papers, but I only read the title, so it was fast. Then what you do is you take all those papers and you only read the abstract. And you pick out of those the ones that have a really cool abstract. So now you're still reading a lot of papers, but you've only read the title in the abstract. And only when you have a very small set of papers that really, really match what you're doing, that's when you start reading the whole paper, reading the methods, reading the results. It's a way to get through a lot of literature really fast. Because again, the title should tell you the take-home message. So you should be able to read the title in the abstract and know whether that paper is worth fully.
That's a great tips. Thank you. Now we have Alex raising hand. Yes, please. Could you hear it? I cannot hear you, Alex. Sorry. He actually sit in the same room with me. Do you want to come here? Ah, try again, please. Hang on. Yeah. And then,
Okay, hello.
hi.
So thank you for the presentation. My question is about, well, rejection is a common thing in publication, and how to politely reject a manuscript. Because, well, there are cases just beyond belief. There are manuscripts that just doesn't sound anything like. Once I had a manuscript and the abstract was not good. The material and methods are it just doesn't fit with the answer, with the question they asked. The result, they got something the result, but the discussion and the figures are just contrast to each other, so it doesn't tell anything. The conclusion doesn't sound, and in my opinion, one of the critical point is they didn't cite the key references. So it's all just, it ticks all the boxes for red flags. Well, it's not my business because I was one of the reviewers, and it is the task of the editor, but I'm just wondering how to politely reject a manuscript. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And maintaining our sense of politeness and all of that, that's really hard in this process. And I personally, as an editor, if a reviewer is not polite, it does make me not interested in their opinion as much, right? Because I think, oh, that was rude. Maybe that person just doesn't, know how. So I think being polite is important. I use what they call here in the United States, they have what they call the compliment sandwich. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. This is supposed to be the way to give bad news politely. So the first thing you do is you say something nice about the manuscript. There's got to be something that was nice about it. You say, sometimes I struggle to find something nice, and I might say, well, it's a really important ecosystem. That's something nice I can say about the manuscript. This ecosystem is important to study. Or the question that they were interested does seem like an important question. So I just try to give them some sort of a compliment that shows that I did read the paper and that I did see that they were working hard and that there's value to what they do. But then I say, unfortunately, there's a lot more work to be done, and then I just give the facts. I like the idea of using the cold and different facts. I was confused is one of my most common reviewer comments that will lead me to reject. If you're confused reading a scientific paper, it's the writer's fault. And I'm saying I'm confused is a pretty polite way to say that you have no idea what was going on in there. So
Okay.
yeah, and you're like, I don't know what's wrong with this. I just have no idea what's going on. So for me, saying I was confused about the methods and then I was not able to comment on the discussion, that's the way I politely say, this is, I don't know what's happening here. So I just try to give that compliment and stick to the facts. I actually, when I write my reviews, I do go back and I edit for politeness. And I think that's something that everybody should do. It's really easy to casually say, why did you do that? That was weird. It's easy to casually say something. And actually, oftentimes, the person on the end of a poorly written paper is a student. That's the fact.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we get better over time. And so, realizing that the person on the other end probably just didn't get the help they needed, and that part of your job is to gently help them understand that they just need to do more work. It's not shameful to have to do more work in science because this is hard. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I just try to give that compliment sandwich, which is you say something nice, you say the hard stuff in the middle, and then at the end you come back and say, I think if the authors are able to address these comments, it will make a nice contribution to science. So just give them that little, I see what you're doing there. Oftentimes, if I see they did a lot of work, I will say that. I can see that this was a ton of work. There were a lot of samples collected. Just giving them that compliment that, yeah, I don't think you're terrible. I just don't know what happened here in this paper. So.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you
you
very much.
so much, Juliana. That's a very
Yeah.
good idea how to respond.
Yeah. And I will tell you the first reviews I wrote, I think were pretty mean. You know what I mean? I got better over time.
Whoops.
Now that I've been doing it for a while, I think I'm a lot nicer. I think you're never supposed to say things like this paper needs a lot of work. Ouch! Who wants to get that in a review, right? But I know I said, so if you think you said something that wasn't nice, it's okay. We've all had it. And so do your best and try to be kind. But you want to be rigorous. As an editor, there's nothing I hate more than a review that says nothing except this is nice. And then you're like, oh no, what do I do with this? So being critical is important. It's important. So.
Yes. Okay. Well noted. Thank you so much, Juliana. I guess it's already midnight. It's over midnight in your place, isn't it? I'm very sorry. I'm very, very sorry taking your resting time. But
That's
I
okay.
hope I don't see any more question in the chat room, I guess. And no one also raising hands. Huh?
Oh, there might be one more. I was gonna say, yes,
hang on.
the documents. So if you guys don't get those documents, just let Jasper know and he can send you those.
Oh yes. I like to say thank you so much. We call him Michael actually. Thank you so much, Michael, for
say Michael.
for connecting us here with you, Julie, James, and Chris. Because it is so we appreciate very much for you sharing here, and you explained it very enjoyable, I guess. So I guess that everyone asking your presentation now, I will provide them.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. And so again, sorry for taking your rest time in this evening.
No problem.
I guess we better give Julian applause and for also for Chris and James. Thank you again. This is very enjoyable. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope we can see you again in the next sharing of session that arranged by us, the Resistance of Biosystematic and Evolution. So thank you again. I over to Gloria, I guess, for closing. Sorry, it will be in Indonesian, Julian.
That's okay. I like hearing it.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good rest for you too, Juliana.
Thank you.
Silakan dulu.
Ya, terima kasih
Masih
Kak
mute.
Vita
Ya,
sudah
ya.
memandu acara ini. Kayaknya Juliana sudah live ya. Oke.
Iya,
Oke,
iya,
baik.
iya.
Terima kasih juga kepada Bapak Ibu yang sudah berpartisipasi atas acara SOS kali ini. Saya sebagai tambahan informasi saja, recording Zoom ini akan di-upload di YouTube PRBE, PR Biosistematika Evolusi. Jadi jika ada yang mau rekamannya bisa mengunjungi akun YouTube kami, dan bagi yang mau PPT-nya bisa kirim email ke santikaye@gmail.com. Baik, kami dari tim SOS sekali lagi mengucapkan terima kasih. Selamat mengikuti kembali nanti di SOS ke-55. Dan mohon maaf dari kami jika ada hal yang kurang berkenan. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Silakan, acara sudah saya tutup. Bagi yang mau live, dipersilahkan. Terima kasih Teh Wita.
Makasih, Glo. Ya, makasih banyak semuanya. Kak Liv ya,
Ya,
Glo.
saya ini ya.